right, welcome for Real Talk with the community, with the Impact Movement. I'm excited about tonight. This is our third installment with our guest, fourth installment without myself. I'm Jimmy McGee. I'm the president of the Impact Movement, and tonight's topic is trauma and resilience in COVID-19. So I'd like to introduce to you our guest, Sheila Wise Rowe. Is a resident in Boston, Massachusetts. She has a master's in counseling, and she recently, March? Had a book. January. A book came out called Healing Racial Trauma. And I'm so excited about that book. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. We got Derek McNeil. He's the president of the Seattle School of Psychology and Theology in Seattle, Washington. So
theology and psychology.
Oh, theology and psychology, excuse me. And so we got one in Boston, we got one in Seattle. And then we also have Professor Howard Stevenson, who is a professor at UPenn in applied psychology, and he's in Philadelphia. So, and I'm Jimmy McGee, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. So we're in 4 different states, 4 different experiences with COVID-19. So Sheila, why don't you give us just some opening comments?
Thank you. Thanks for having me in this conversation. It's a timely one. It's an important one. I think when I think about trauma, I think about Jeremiah 6:14, which speaks about, they've treated the wounds of my people carelessly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. And that in so many ways that racial trauma is rearing its head around the whole COVID-19 pandemic, but it's an issue that our communities have been dealing with for generations. And this is a moment where we're seeing with COVID-19, a lot of the facades are really being peeled back. And it's an opportunity to really look at the raw realness of what it is that people of, Black, Indigenous, other people of color have experienced and are experiencing. And so in a lot of the conversations, there is some talk about systemic racism, but very little. And there's even less about racial trauma. And racial trauma is something that we've got to look at because we're in the midst of this. And when this pandemic is over, we're going to be carrying this unless it's dealt with. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to spend some more time with you, Jimmy. So I was in Montgomery. So Jimmy dragged a bunch of us to Montgomery, Alabama. And we had a symposium around racial trauma. And wow, I have to say, it's an understatement to say that visiting the Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum was life altering. It was so profound. And just really bringing home the reality for me of what we have endured. And that as a people, that as Black folk, we are amazing. We are miracles. We are resilient. But we have endured a lot of pain. And so I'm going to stop there.
Wow. Well, I want to hear from Derek. Derek was a partner with us with the Impact Movement. We didn't do it alone. We did it with the Seattle School as well as the Allender Center when we held that symposium, Race, Trauma, and the Gospel. But Derek, do you have some opening statements or thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because I'll pick up on Sheila's comments, particularly about Montgomery. I realized in many ways I had been denying my level of collective trauma or the level of trauma we all experience. I think what my parents taught me is, hey, keep tough, keep going. You got this, keep going. You got this, you keep going. And so in some ways, even though I think I had parents who helped me develop a certain type of resilience, they also helped me deny some things. And when I stood in Montgomery looking at the lynching memorial, as we call it, but it's Peace and Justice Memorial, and taking in the sort of image of bodies being hanging from trees if you were lynched. And you couldn't help but feel a sense of your own connectedness to that and the sense of how much people have gone through for me to be living. And so one of the things that I'm struck by is how much I've learned to deny the trauma that my body of generations has experienced. And so part of the pain of COVID-19 is I would have loved it if we had equitable response in terms of mortality to COVID-19, to deaths. But when you hear brown people suffering outside of our numbers, outside of our percentages, it just reminds me again how much we've experienced in our bodies, how much we've held generationally, how wounded we have been, even though we've learned to, in some ways, be strong. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to begin thinking about what that message of be strong is, the one that I learned. I have a professor at one of the schools I went to he said, you have a John Henry syndrome. Everybody knows the myth of John Henry, the African man who was still driving and he was going to compete with a machine. Mm. Well, the end of the story is he competes with the machine, he wins, and he drops dead. And so in some real ways, we've learned some degree of capacity to be strong, but it's not necessarily sustainable in some contexts. And we have to talk to each other about what it means to be resilient in difficult, challenging physical times.
Howard Stevenson, why don't you give some opening comments or thoughts or reflections?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a pleasure being here with Sheila and Derek, and also you, Jimmy, to meet you again for the first time, I guess. And since we've been talking about Montgomery, I think related to the topic for tonight, the notion of racial trauma is incredibly important because we have often thought of it around what's happening to Black and brown people today, and that there is we know more research about the impact of racism on health outcomes. And we are seeing now live, what it's like to have not only contemporary racism be a barrier in how people not only get access to healthcare during a crisis and during a pandemic, but also historical racism in the way that what have we been lied to about and what has not been given to us decades ago affect what happens today. And so the work that we're doing and thinking about how historical racism, historical trauma that's related to racism from the past still affects us. You were talking about my brother's memorial and the way in which when people go there, the way that he's brilliantly set up the museum. When you go to the place with the columns of names of people who have been lynched, I've had friends call me from the auditorium, finding a loved one that they had never even heard about or known about, or there were stories about the person who was lynched, the loved one who was lynched, but it was a different story than the real story. And the fact that they were crying on the phone, talking about, this is somebody in my family. I did not expect to find somebody in my family here. And so when we think about racial trauma, we got to think about historical trauma and how what has happened in the past still affects us to this day.
Mm-hmm. So true. So true. So I want to tell our audience for the next few minutes, I'm going to be asking our guests a couple of questions. But this is not just an experience for me. So if you are watching with us on Facebook Live, I'm not sure about YouTube. I know we're live on YouTube. Please feel free to write a question in, and then we will pose that question to the panelists for the last 30 minutes of our time as we engage this conversation. As we start this thing, I want us to start out with some simplicity here. As a kid, I remember hearing about trauma centers. I live in Atlanta, and Grady Hospital is they said if you get shot, stabbed, or you're coming out of a fire, that's a trauma center. And so that's a place you want to go. But we're not talking about trauma in terms of a body in that fashion. Can I get some definition from you guys of when you hear the word trauma, what is it that you think our audience need to understand when we hear that term trauma? Either one of you, Sheila, you wanted to go, or
sure. You know what? When I think about trauma, and particularly racial trauma, I'm thinking of the consequences emotionally of racism. of how racism in its multifaceted ways in which it's expressed affects Black and brown bodies and minds. And I think that that's, you know, we know that racism comes in various forms. And I think that oftentimes we have, you know, some white folk who think that it's just about either hating Black people, or they have a sense of, you know, a very small sense of what this is. And they are not aware, or they're in denial about systemic racism and the effect that it has on Black and brown folk, and how we navigate through life, how we, you know, try to believe that there is actually a hope and a future for us. And trauma is something that really can hijack our ability to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think I'll piggyback on Sheila's, the sense of something being overwhelming to your system, or overpowering your system. And so whether it be racism, and usually you think of it both personally and systemically.
Yeah.
Because there's moments I can overcome personal racism. Someone says they don't like me, or don't, you know, think whatever about me. But it becomes much more difficult to overcome and override systemic racism, where a system is set up to resist me or constrain me in certain ways. And so when I think about trauma, I think about those things that would overwhelm my system, that would cause it to shut down and be inoperable, whether it be a temporary shutdown or a long-term shutdown. That's how I think about trauma in a sense.
Yeah, and I would just add to both Sheila and Derek that the way that we think about trauma is also how it is dehumanizing, and how in many respects it's unpredictable. And for many of us, what makes it so traumatic, what makes it disturbing to the person, and to the person's body, mind, and spirit, is that we are not prepared to be dehumanized. We are not prepared to have unpredictable, inhuman acts against us, whether it's ideology or whether it's physical. The reason trauma is important, because it affects our bodies, our feelings, and our thoughts, is that it lingers. It lingers, and it is re-upped, it's re-triggered whenever we see similar situations. And it may be situations in that remind me of the past dehumanization, or it could be situations where I'm witnessing other people go through those dehumanizations. That's how I think about trauma, vicarious as much as it is physical, emotional, and cognitive.
So the example I've heard many times is the idea of someone being raped. There's a trauma in being raped, but there's a trauma in the memory of the rape that haunts still in the body. So the person relives what their body experienced, even though the event is in the past, the experience is still pretty much still in the body and in every aspect of their humanity. Is that true?
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of raising the issue and maybe bringing it back to body. I think I've become more sensitive to the impact, not just on my mind or our minds, but our physical capacity, the inhibiting and distorting of who we are holistically, not just simply in how we think about ourselves. And I think, you know, I at one point thought of trauma as a mental, much more mental than full body, mental and physical, and the sense that the body carries the wounds.
So the whole idea is that we tend to fragment and compartmentalize our existence, but really we're a whole person. And so when trauma happens, it happens to the whole person. It doesn't just happen to my body, my emotions, my soul, my mind, my thoughts are filled with this. Now, specifically, we're in COVID-19. And we're bringing up some historical trauma of race, but COVID-19 is coming through right now as a wave throughout the entire world. How would you explain the trauma of COVID-19 upon us, because some of the people in our audience are not Black or brown, they're white. Some are Asian, some are Latino. So it's a very diverse, eclectic space. Is it possible that trauma can be experienced communally across racial categories when we look at COVID-19?
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Sheila.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're dealing with loss. This has blindsided everybody across the world, and there are ways in which the trauma is universal, and yet I don't focus so much on that, only because it has done specific damage to people of color. And to Black folk particularly, and also for Latinx, the Latinx community. And so I also want that to be looked at, because I feel like oftentimes when we do these kind of universalities, which it is true, people we all are traumatized on some level. And yet I know that as a Black person, this has triggered me. And so, I actually realized that I was feeling some kind of way and trying to figure out, well, what is that? And what came up for me was a memory of my grandmother and grandfather and uncles and extended family who died in the 1930s because of a TB outbreak, and there were no hospitals for Black people. And so for me, I wasn't even aware of that's what was going on. And it really took some time for me to just sit and to listen and to pray about what's going on. Why am I so agitated and stirred up? Because the fact that we're not getting tested, that the pre-existing conditions that are a part of systemic racism is not being looked at. There are ways in which we're not getting the same medical treatment. And so that has come up for me, and I feel like that is possibly coming up for a lot of other Black folk.
Howard, you're going to add to it too as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all have realized the disparities and how they're illuminated, not so much in the virus, but in how we think about who should get cared for during the virus, who should get resources, who should get equipment, who should get what it takes to protect yourself. And I think in many respects, there's a commonality of dehumanization across different racial groups, in ways that I think, we can learn from. In many communities of color, people are learning, grassroots organizations are teaching families in neighborhoods, that they're there for them in ways that other systems have not been there. And so in the same way that we notice these racial disparities in care, we are also noticing incredible amounts of courage and sort of on the fly sort of care, if that makes any sense, that's required or necessary in ways that we didn't think needed to happen. We thought our traditional systems would stand up for us, and we're finding when they break down, it's a whole different world. It's a different country. It's a different community when you see that. And I think, one argument around resilience is can we teach our young people, can we teach our communities about that narrative, the narrative of how they see us under crisis and how we can respond to those moments, not just now, but also in the future.
I want to see if I can translate some of that I'm hearing, because my head was, I think when Sheila was talking about the opportunities that are taken away because of color or race. And Howard, you just talked about one, there used to be a space where I had options and those options are lost. And the word constraint comes up when I think about trauma, both in a physical, personal sense. When someone constrains you and you're unsafe, that's a traumatic experience. when you're culturally constrained, you have little options, you have few choices, you are in some ways ostracized or not allowed. That's a constraint. So I kind of translate that into collective trauma when the society structures itself in such a way it constrains you. It gives you little options. You're unable to create narratives that have possibility, and that you have despair, and you are constrained and despairing. And so some of the challenge is, as we talk about resilience, is how do we find either options in our networks, and how do we find stories that gives us some possibilities and some hopes and allows us to escape this sort of cultural and sometimes personal constraints. I was held down is interesting, Jimmy. You talked about the issue of rape. I was held down. I had no choice. The sense of violation occurred to me. Well, in the same ways it's happening culturally. We are constrained. We were held down. We didn't have much choice. We were chained. We are now socially, structurally chained. So those constraints lead to the sense of few choices, few options, and being overwhelmed in terms of our systems.
You know, I gotta tell you, as I thought about this subject almost right away when we started this series, because when I can still remember when the WHO announced it was a global pandemic, and just like you guys in our world, we began to shut down programs, shut down travel, began to realize that people were going to be isolated in their homes. And for a brief moment, I think I said it last week, I did think, I shared with my wife, I did think this was going to be an equitable experience for the whole world to be in this together. And then as the numbers began to come out, like you said, Sheila, and one of the things that we're not mentioning, yes, we're talking about the pre-existing conditions of diabetes or lupus or obesity or hypertension. And then we're talking about this whole idea, if you're socially economic in a lower strand, the idea that you are now living in close proximity to a large number of people puts everybody at risk. But then when we start talking about essential workers, that a vast amount of people of color are essential workers. They're the people picking up your trash. They're the ones that got to restock your grocery stores. And when I go into the stores, some of the stores have put up plexiglass to protect their employees, but many of them don't have masks, don't have gloves. And so they take that back home. My brother-in-law works at a hospital, and he comes back home. And so he's at a hospital, but he puts my sister and their children at risk per se when they go through this. So I think when I put my mind to really embrace the COVID-19 experience across the board and then get acquainted to the numbers, it causes me to weep. Mm-hmm. So the question I want to ask you, what are healthy ways to engage trauma? How can I go through this? Both Sheila and Derek, you guys talked about how mama and daddy tell us, just press it down. You're going to be okay. Be strong. Is this a time where I'm just supposed to be strong? Or is there another way for me to be strong, but also to not repress it and ignore it, but go through it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, I think we're probably said already in some ways that, yes, we've got to find other means by which we manage this. It is deeply, even in terms of your tears, Jimmy, mourning is an act of connection. And if we cry together, that allows us to build resilience. Crying alone can leave us in our own singular despair. And so I want to say people, in terms of resilience. How do we find communities, connect with each other, even if it's online, whatever way we do it at this point, we're not to have a lot of contact. We got to fight through those and talk to each other and have some conversation and weep together and recognize in each other a sort of common collective pain. That itself can produce resilience. I was taught don't cry. Well, the truth is that's not what my body needs. It actually needs to cry with, not cry alone, but cry with, or talk with, or be with. And so I think some of the things that, as a very as a cultural group that was much more collectivist than the dominant cultural group. Some of what it meant to go to church and stand in the pew and sing with each other was resilient, whether we call it resilient or not. Just to listen to Sister So-and-so's testimony, how God did something. Those things are redemptive stories that we need to incorporate as we share with each other our tears, our hurt, and in some ways our empowerment or co-powerment.
I think the other piece is really, we talked about how trauma lodges in the body, and how are the ways in which we are exerting that, getting that, releasing some of that pent up energy, before it becomes a destructive way. And, allowing the tears to flow is one way of, emotionally releasing. There are other ways, whether it is exercising, walking, noticing how it is that you're breathing. Where are in your body are you feeling tension? And really getting quiet and listening to what is the source of that? What is triggering you in that moment? Whether it was a news report that you saw, whether it was finding out that there was a loss of someone close, or even someone who wasn't so close. We are constantly bombarded with every day, every hour, there's new updates around COVID-19. It's traumatizing. And, even when I said earlier, the universality, the reality is that we all are listening to this, and it is traumatizing, and we all are losing people, and we're responding to it differently, and it's impacting us differently. But we need to look at how is it affecting us, because we will go into the future carrying this in our bodies. And we talked about pre-existing conditions. This exacerbates those conditions by holding it in, by not releasing it, whether it's sharing openly with our mouths, trying to exert it from our bodies, figuring out how are we breathing, where are we relaxation, whether we're praying. Those are ways in which we can release some of this.
Okay. I have one more question. I'm going to start with you, Howard. So the thing about COVID-19 is that it's an interruption, meaning that the cycle of life was occurring before COVID-19, and now it's still happening. So give you an example, a dear friend of mine, a mentor, and his wife are very close to me. His wife died, and he's in Florida, but he's from New York. And so now, and then the next day, one of our campus coaches sent me a picture of his beautiful brown baby that was just born that morning. And so in the midst of COVID-19 and the spacing and these distancing, we still have death and life happening as it did before COVID-19. What do we do with that? Because we're not able to express and be next to each other to serve each other.
Yeah. I mean, tragically, it feels like, when you are praying, but you don't know what to say, or you are, in your mourning, but you have no words to make sense of it. And, going along with what Sheila and Derek said, there's a way to manage trauma, or a way to heal from trauma, is to just let whatever out, and there's a way in which it may seem to violate certain rules about how we feel, or how we speak to each other, or how we emote, that some of those rules need to be challenged in order to, sometimes the mourning or the moaning, if you can imagine moaning as a way to express things that you cannot put into words, I would see as not only spiritual and cultural, but, one of the responses to healing to the kind of tragedies that you're talking about and that we are all seeing. So, there's a way that we talk about the Spirit praying for us and making utterances that we cannot ourselves make. And it takes faith to believe that that's going to happen. But I believe that even doubt and being at the edge of rejecting faith is still faith journey. And how do we let our people have that during these times as part of the journey, as opposed to a rejection of faith?
Wow.
Mhm.
It's around 8:30. There is a scripture I want to share because I think for some reason when we read the text, we don't see depression, we don't see mourning, and in Luke, there's a depiction where Jesus is actually praying and weeping at the same time. They're going to show it up here on the board in a minute. It's Luke 19:41 and 42, and he said, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." And so the one thing I tell my students, I tell my staff, I tell everyone, the reason why I love Jesus so much is because he is fully human and he teaches me how to be fully human.
Mm-hmm.
He models the very things he desires us to be in such a way that he gives us permission. And I say that as a verse to transition us because we really want to invite our audience to ask questions right now and begin to pour them in. And I got one now from Matthew Best. He says, for friends and family that may not be used to thinking about this topic on the intellectual level, we're discussing it. How do we begin to have these conversations with them? People like our older family members who are carrying a lot of this trauma, but don't have words to discuss it like you all do.
The first, go ahead. The first thing came to mind for me is what I put in my mouth and eat. Because all of us can have conversations about eating better and eating in a way, because I think, I was taught in some way eat for pleasure. And so if it tastes good, and there's a lot of food that tastes good, and I've learned I have to eat not just simply for pleasure, but also for health. And so talking to family, parents and sisters and brothers about, hey, how's your weight and how are you doing physically? Because part of what we're talking about in terms of trauma and resilience comes not just simply from our brains and our minds thinking, but our bodies. And we actually have to focus on our bodies in a way we haven't focused on as much. I also think, we can't think only about our bodies, but our collective bodies. It's not just simply what I put in my mouth, but who I engage and act and be around, who I put myself with. So the entry to me of resilience is really working on who I'm with, who I'm around, who talks with me, and then what I eat. And I think even in just terms of my own learning, my first thing is I drink more water. I spent most of my life dehydrated, and I have kidney problems because I was dehydrated. So learning that I needed to drink more water was like revelation for me. So in some ways, it may not be as intellectual as much as it is embodied. We are embodied beings, and how do we start taking care of our bodies to then take care of our minds and take care of our relationships?
Howard, you going to jump in too? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think singing. My father was. He used to say similar things to my brother and my sister and I when we were growing up. So you guys talk, but you don't. You have book knowledge, but you might not have, like street well, there were no streets in Southern Door. It's more like you don't have like country knowledge, right? You don't have like workable, practical. He was always saying stuff like that, and there were times in which he would say to us, you guys have the words to say it right, but he would sing a song to represent what he felt, or he would hum and he would moan a song, and that would represent his speech. That would be his articulation, and I think I've learned that from him, that we don't have to have the words, but we have to have, there are many ways that our culture has given us to speak, and make it plain, as it were.
Yeah, I wanted to just add that I feel like a lot of times there are stories that are part of our family's histories, and we've heard them, but no one has ever actually taken the time to really go deep in terms of, well, how did we make it through? What did that actually look like?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes we discover, that there are ways in which we had support, and whether it was through the church, whether it was through neighbors and friends, where we were able to release some of that energy when we were in church and doing the Holy Ghost dance, and we there are ways in which just our faith sustained us. And I think that is a way of kind of opening the conversation in terms of looking at where may there still be some trauma that is now still affecting us as a family, because we have this, trauma that passes through generations, and sometimes it's around the stories, it's around the history. And so sitting down with our family members and asking, about let's look at this. Let's look at how has this affected us physically, emotionally? How does our elders think that happened, and what was the thing that sustained them, and will help to sustain us?
Well, and I love all those things about stories. I mean, I find myself attracted to my elders all the time because there's so much wisdom that comes with it. I have one more question, but I just want to make a small comment about singing. Chris Martin from Coldplay started doing concerts on Instagram. And right away, as soon as I heard it, I put on Facebook, I can't wait if Fred Hammond or Commission, are they going to come up with some music at this time to release it? And, I'm not a Pentecostal kind of dude, although I got these tendencies, but I felt like I almost spoke into existence because Fred just came out with a concert. In a second concert, and then he actually had a song that emerged from COVID-19 that he shared last Saturday. Let's go to our next question from James Puglisi. It's Italian, I believe. He says, as a white Christian male, I hear trauma being expressed by more than a few white Christians in situations that seem more like inconveniences, which must just exasperate others' situation. What are your thought of that? His question of how some white Christians are thinking this whole issue of trauma is just inconveniences. It's not really trauma.
Yeah, I think if you ever spent time with people who have gone through the unpredictable, dehumanizing experience, whether it was rape that you talk about, or being an immigrant or a refugee from a war-torn country, trying to come into the land of the free, home of the brave, and still get treated like you are not human. And then watch people go from that place to a place of recovery, you would know that trauma is not something made up, right? And it's common to believe that, but people would think that trauma is an excuse. I use that as an excuse, so then I don't have to behave, I don't have to follow certain laws or rules. But I would argue that they haven't spent time in the suffering of someone with trauma or in the healing of that trauma. And if they did, they would think very differently about, it's not something you can easily get rid of just because it bothers other people.
I think this is too where I will both respect a person's subjective experience of distress. And I've known European Americans and other ethnic groups, an individual might experience personal trauma, and they've had someone to do something to them, harm them in a certain type of way, and it overwhelmed their system. And there is some degree of subjectivity, but when we're talking about collective trauma, it's a harder thing to think about in terms of the dominant culture and the access and the constraints that people of color have in this context. This is why I use the language of constraint. It, for me, shapes, when you talk about inconvenience, it suggests something that was in the way. And quite frankly, I think this is what's a little, I'm not fully confusing. I think I'm feigning some confusion when I hear European American Christians talk about they're being traumatized, they're being, people are thinking hostile things towards them. And well, it's in comparison to the experiences of other people who've either been brought here or enslaved, brought here or came here and then enslaved, it's hard to know how to compare that. And so there is a subjective experience of trauma, but what we're talking about, when we're talking about collective experience, and we use a language for me of constraints, it's hard to recognize, or at least begin to see some differences in what people are talking about. And trauma then can be a popular word or phrase used when anybody feels distressed. And I think traumatic experience is more than just simply distress.
Yeah. You know, I started thinking about this whole thing about triggers. So I'm going to mention some statistics recently, but I started thinking about how the government was really ruling our lives, telling us what spaces we were in. Some people had the National Guard come in, and I started thinking of a variety of people. I started thinking of Jewish people who lived under a police state in Nazi Germany. I started thinking, as Black people, we self-imposed ourselves to keep ourselves protected, that we would stay in at certain times. I remember visiting my great aunt after my great uncle died in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they would tell us horror stories that the worst part of their life was Friday through Sunday when people were drinking, and that people would come through the community just randomly shooting people like squirrels, and so that they would isolate themselves in homes to protect themselves. But we got three things that are rising now during COVID-19, and I would love to hear your perspective. We see the rise of gun sales. Gun sales are going up. We also see the rise of alcohol consumption. It's going up. But also we see the rise of domestic violence. When you hear these three things, and I imagine more is coming up, maybe narcotic consumption or whatever, what, as therapists or people, what does this tell you about how we're medicating ourselves, or what we're doing in our psyche to address this trauma?
I mean, if we're not dealing with the trauma, it's going to come out in one way or another. And oftentimes, you know, we see these symptoms, and whether it's fear, whether it's rage, and, you know, the fear part, I'm going to go buy a gun. I'm going to protect myself. Rage is another one. You know, we often go into our addictions. And so whether it's food, whether it's alcohol, as you said, we're medicating because we're not dealing with it. And then there also are ways in which just how we've talked about this and treating our bodies, and that, you know, so we're actually making ourselves sicker because we're not dealing with it. And so, you know, I think that is the huge issue is, will we deal with it rather than run to our medications, whether it's a gun or whether it's a drink, or, you know, people are stuck inside, they're, you know, at each other. And that's why we're seeing domestic violence increase. There's unhealed trauma there, often traumatizing people in their homes. And so we've got to figure out, even as a church, like, how do we support people in this time when there's social distancing, and yet there's a need for connection. And a need for places where we can offload some of this.
Yeah, I think that is. I'm sorry. That is the frightening thing when, again, you lock people, and I'm going to use the language to be a little bit provocative. You lock people into their homes, and they've already had, say, some tension with a spouse, and deteriorate. So in some ways, it reveals the vulnerability that was underneath probably before. And the sense that, again, people are constrained with their abusers, or firearms, you know, it's kind of a fight-flight response. I'll get a gun that might then, you know, and I had fantasies of getting a gun at one point, and my wife looked at me like, "Are you nuts?" And I had to say, yes, I was, because in some ways we recognize these are some degree human responses to threat and human attempts to cope with threat. And how do we, in some ways, care for ourselves, connect with each other, to help each other manage the sense of threat? So there's, at one point, I think it was simply a question of, hey, I'll discipline myself to not drinking. Well, the truth, I need help managing the sense of threat that I'm feeling, which is why I'm self-medicating. And self-medication can also be punching somebody. And so how do we, in some ways, manage those pieces, get support around that, find networks of people who will both hold us accountable and challenge us and hold us and care for us?
Well, you know, in the impact movement, we're a collegiate ministry. We deal with students all the time. And I'm imagining right now, whether they're freshmen or even seniors, there are people in the middle. This COVID-19 is just so disruptive to a young person just entering adulthood. Can you imagine you've done all this work and now your graduation is taken from you? The way you're trying to close out your academic career is done. You're a freshman, you're saying, wow, this is my first year in school and this is what I'm experiencing. And as an 18 to 22 or 24-year-old, they never really thought about trauma. They were managing it under maybe the auspices of a parent or uncle or grandparent. How would you encourage someone in their 18 to 22 age to begin to learn good habits to address trauma that they're experiencing? Or another word I'm going to add to this, anxiety. What would you say? I think, you know, we all got kids, you know, and my son is, you know, was sent home from Morehouse from his freshman year. What is it that you would say? And again, I want to invite our audience, please, if you got any questions, send them to us. We're going to pose them to our panelists tonight. But so can you help our college students?
I would throw out that, you know, this, you know, being able to be at least willing to listen to their stories. You know, the proverb we use, the lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. And many of our young people have lost rituals through this process. They've lost celebration. They've lost expected sort of safety net rituals that allowed them to be freshmen, to be sophomore. You know, identity is somewhat deconstructed when those rituals are gone. And I'd say, you know, how can we listen to their narratives, their stories about the loss of those rituals? How can we start to create new rituals, right? Because this may go on. You know, how do we create new rituals for them that affirm, you know, developmentally what they should have gotten as a freshman in that freshman year or that sophomore year, you know, or frankly, you know, the graduation year. But I think, you know, those are just a couple of thoughts around, you know, how do I listen to their particular story as central to part of the healing?
I think another piece is just allowing space to actually sit there with it and to be able to share exactly what has come up for them. They basically are facing these losses. They'll never get that back. And so the reality of that you're not alone in this, you know, that the Lord is with you, and there are people in your family who can come alongside and support you. Where's the places where there just needs to be a space to also rest? I mean, I think that's the other thing, is that we can often just go into restless kind of activism, or just you know, I got to do something, versus can we slow down a bit and just sit for a little bit? And if you need to cry, and if you need to yell. But I'm going to be here with you, and that we can be a presence to them in the midst of their pain around this. It's a loss.
I so agree with that. You know, my kids have lived pretty comfortably, and I'm grateful. And I'm not sure I've always prepared them to live with loss. And the truth is that loss is a part of living. There are necessary losses to living. And how do we, I think as Sheila said, and as Howard was saying, how do we come alongside them and sit with the pain of it, as opposed to tell them they should distract themselves with something else? And it is a period where it's hard to, unless you're really trying real hard, to distract yourself from all the pain that's around us. And so how do we, in some ways, as communities, listen to, weep with, talk with, give them space to hurt and hurt with, and not be left alone? And so I think one of the things that my parents knew that I didn't is they knew how to, in some way, struggle. I'm not always sure they struggled adaptively, but they learned to cope and live with hurt. And we're in another period where this COVID-19 is forcing us to have to face the capacity to hurt and to heal. And to avoid that is in some ways to simply live a life of distraction. It is not a life of mission and purpose. It is not the ability to persevere or sustain. And we'll have to learn to do that as a community.
You know, historically, we all have indelible marks in history that we engage. Most of us, I can still remember when 9/11 happened. I was taking my middle son to preschool that day. And there were all this chatter in the street about what happened, and I had to turn on the radio. I can still remember as a little kid when Dr. King died and what happened. So I do have a question for you guys, but I want to give our audience one more time. Please give us some more questions. We got a few minutes left. So you kind of threw me a twist there when I heard it out loud, Sheila, when you said, they'll never get it back. These are real losses, and they'll never get it back. I mean, I started thinking about that. I was like, wow, a graduating singer, he's not coming back to school. She's not coming back to school. They're not going to have a ceremony. That's it. So if you're helping these group of college students, then the most important question that I feel like I need to ask on behalf of them, can you give them hope? What type of foundation of hope do you think they need to wrestle with to survive this?
You know, I firmly believe that part of maturity is dealing with the reality that loss exists, that unmet need is there. And yet there is also love, there's beauty, and I feel like we have to enter into, and I would encourage them to really look at where are the places where God is. God is showing up. God showed up. The fact that you got to year 4, you finished, you didn't get to walk, but that is a miracle. As a Black and brown person to actually make it that far, that is a miracle. And you might not celebrate it on the stage, but your family is going to celebrate it. We're going to celebrate you. And you have a future ahead of you. And so how do we come alongside and encourage them to really dream and to believe that there's more? Their life is stretched out ahead of them. There's so much more. And there are many times where you read people saying, well, what would you tell your younger self? And it's sort of like, I can understand when you're that young, you think, well, this is it. This is a loss and I'm never going to get it back. And you can spiral down into a depression. But if you hold on, really, I know where I'm at now. I am light years from where I was. And I'm grateful. And I'm looking for where are the places where I can have some places of gratitude, even in the midst of a pandemic. There's still life. There's still beauty. There's still people who are there, who love you, who are friends, who are family. And God, who's promised never to leave us nor forsake us.
Yeah. What about you, gentlemen? How would you give us hope? What's your thoughts about these things?
I'll say this and what Howard closes out. I think what we talked about earlier, Jimmy, you even mentioned this about the stories that older people have told you and the stories that we have learned and heard. I call them redemptive stories. It is tapping into redemptive stories. The best story we have as Christians is that from death can come life. From death can come life. And in some ways, we also know that there's no transformed life without death. And so some of the sort of metaphors that we hold as people of faith is that, hey, when it looks the worst possible scenario, there is possibility. You have to hold on and wait for it, which is what we sang in church, is what they preached in sermons, is what we heard in testimonies. You have to get through this dark period and get over in midnight hour, etc. All those sort of thematic pieces were parts of a redemptive story. And so is what, I'd mentioned my kids. I have not taught them as well about redemption in their narratives, in their self-narratives, in their stories about themselves. How do they overcome, bear, struggle, work hard, push through, and they will make it? And in that, there's assumption that there's more than them at work. There's more than them at play, that something can twist and shape in their stories. So the hope, particularly in terms of resilience, this notion of you get stronger, you don't probably even know fully how resilient you are till you go through something. And that the resilience itself pushes and pulls and creates something in you. But you have to have some seeds of the possibility of a self that can be redeemed, and a story that can be reworked, and a possibility that can be found.
Yeah, just to piggyback, I would be looking for in a trauma like this. It's very common for us to self-blame. For anyone who's gone through a trauma, first instinct is to say, what did I do to bring this about? Even if there's overwhelming evidence that it was outside of me, it was a natural disaster. And I think, you can think about what brings us from trauma to resilience is this notion of forgiveness. Could I forgive myself? How do I learn to forgive myself? You can think about domestic violence as a function of trauma, that I haven't forgiven myself, so it's hard to forgive my partner, right? And so in some respects, do those rituals, do the old, is the new sort of, the new rituals going back to the old rituals, where we end up pretty much, learning how to forgive ourselves in a sense, and realize it's not just about us; it's larger than us, and in that see some light. And I think we have a history in our culture around forgiveness. I don't mean overnight or as soon as I want to be done with the pain, but it is a sense of there's something larger going on here than just me.
Yeah. Well, there's a last question here. I think it's directed to me, but I'm gonna share it with you guys since I got people smarter than me on this panel. It's from Chris. He says, please share your thoughts on how we as an organization, the Impact Movement, can assist students in dealing with trauma in light of the current circumstances of social distancing. So how can we assist students when we're told that there's social distancing? Well, how would you answer that question? And then we're going to close out after this.
Yeah, I think you have online platforms such as Zoom, which is free, and just having an open kind of a forum where people can kind of touch base, having smaller cohorts of people. I mean, you have the Impact Movement is all around the country. So on those different campuses and sites, there are people who have formed small communities. And if they had, come if you want to come. If you need to debrief and talk and just share and get prayer, the Zoom forum and the one that we're on currently are all ways to do that. And so I would encourage people to just stay connected in that way. I know some of the colleges are working and really hard at like the chaplaincy is shut down, the chapel's office, but they're providing those services. They're providing either online chapel and the ability for people on the team, staff, professors to reach out to students and just touching base with them. I think those are some ways.
Okay.
I would say, look, just along with what Sheila's saying, if you're funny, tell jokes. If you sing, sing. If you rap, start rapping online too. I mean, in some respects, use what God gave you.
Yeah, I like that. I'm hoping that creative stuff would just kick in on people. One thing that I would tell people that we don't do as often, we don't write each other notes anymore. Just an encouraging note. Right? I can't imagine. Last week or 2 weeks ago was my birthday, And it felt so good to get birthday cards and to read just a little paragraph to see that my life matters and that I have value. And I think if we could practice that, today's world, we're probably not going to write it. We're not going to send stamps, but we can text people today. And we try to do that in our organization. It's that we want to, let's play tag and reach out to someone randomly and say, today, how are you doing? I miss you. This is the thing. I'm missing your absence. Can you do this for us? I think communication is one of the most important things that we need to do. And it's not just extroverts that need it either. It's introverts. And so I think we just need to be kind to each other. You know, this is a journey that I'm not sure what the end's going to look like when this COVID-19 is over. But I know talking to you guys and helping us realize that it's okay to say that we do feel anxiety, that we do feel traumatic experiences, that it is something collective, is important for us to begin to process. I think my hope for, as I listen to you guys, you know, I spend a lot of time in a variety of things I read. I've been fascinated with the Jewish story as much as I've been fascinated with our story out of slavery. But one of the things that I continue to read, from whether it's The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal or A Survivor Cafe by another Elizabeth Rosner, is this notion that some of these books give me hope of how we can go through these issues with a sense of focus and determination. My wife asked me the other day, she says, Jimmy, have you heard of this book? I think it's in your library, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I read that when I was in high school, and it gave me a lot of hope. I'm going to recommend just one book besides Sheila's, and it's Sheila Rambo's book called Spirit and Trauma. And it helped me come through Easter this time and saying that we move from Good Friday to Sunday so quickly that we don't live in Saturday so much. And Saturday, Sheila, I can remember you telling me it was Saturday for us is every day of the week some days. I remember you telling me that when I saw you a few months ago or last year. And the notion is that these are things that we can be attuned to and learn from so that we can make this world better. I'm hoping that the impact movement will be better and we will really care about people even more now than ever once we leave out of this experience. That we'll be more tuned, not just by how we feel, but we'll use our senses to see how others feel and be what God has called us to be, a good neighbor. And I think tonight you helped us in that. And just listening to you gave me hope. It gave me encouragement. I battled my own tears just listening to you. So I want to say thank you to Derek McNeil, Sheila Wise Rowe, Howard Stevenson. You've been a gift to us. And I hope that in the recordings, people will come back and listen to this because we're going to need this as we go forward. As I close tonight and say again, thank you to you. Next week, we're going to have 3 different pastors from 3 different traditions. We're going to have an AME pastor who's an MD. He's in his mid or late 60s. We're going to have a Pentecostal pastor from Milwaukee. He's the bishop, and he's in his 50s. And then we're going to have a young lady, Dr. Nicole Martin, who is Baptist, who's in her late 30s to come. And we're going to raise a question, is there a word from the Lord? And see if these pastors, if they're wrestling with the notion of people who care over the spiritual life of people, how do they find comfort and how they can give comfort to us? So again, I want to say thank you to our guests. Y'all did a phenomenal job. Thank you for coming to spend a little bit of time with us this Monday. And I pray blessing on you guys and protection in Boston, in Philly, and Seattle. And God willing, I look forward to seeing you in person again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you. Thank you, Derek.
All right. Don't hang up. She's going to close us out, and then I'll talk to you when the song is over.
Okay.